Subreddit HFY The Foundling Part 1 Written by Polite Badger. Hine and Maverick rode along a broad stretch of road, with mostly barren fields to either side. A few round, squat houses lay far off, tucked within patches of yellowing trees. There had been no rain for some time, and dust kicked up around the Gallopini's hooves as she plodded along, pulling what small amount of harvest they could spare to sell. Hopefully, some rich city folk would pay good money for the small purple-brown tubers jostling around in bushels at the back of the wagon beside the broken domestic generator. Maverick had done a painstaking, but ultimately patchwork job of fixing it, apparently for the last time nearly a fortnight ago, and the thing had finally given out for good a few days ago. Hine was forever worried that the thing would catch fire or explode. She wasn't sure exactly what it was capable of, but had a healthy amount of skepticism when it came to complex machinery, especially those off-world. It was about midday, and they'd already been traveling for several hours. The sun hung high overhead, in the turquoise blue sky. Hine wore a bonnet-like headdress to protect her delicate pale green skin from the glare. She glanced over at Maverick, who, no matter how she pestered him, refused to cover his hat at all. He claimed that hats made his horns itch and his ears hurt. Hine knew it was a front. He was just being a contrarian. She hoped the city folk would not think they were uncouth and backwards because of it. She had made sure Maverick was wearing his very best clothing. At least they'd look somewhat respectable. Hine nervously fingered the carefully folded fabrics that lay across her lap. They were very fine. She had woven, adorned, and blessed them herself. These were some of her best work, and had taken many days to complete. She was loath to sell them, especially to off-world tourists, but they needed the money if they were ever to get that blasted generator fixed. The city was loud and crowded, and full of strange Xenos from other worlds. It put Hine on edge. Maverick patted his wife's shoulder a bit stiffly, feeling guilty for asking her to come. Maverick knew they were finally getting close. Far, far in the distance he could see shuttles ferrying all manner of goods and people up to the many ships and docks orbiting just above the upper atmosphere. Maverick looked up at them with longing. As a youngling, he had wanted nothing more than to travel the galaxy in search of distant stars and grand adventures. By the gods, he still wanted to, even just once. It was a pipe dream, though. Hine blanched whenever he brought the subject up. Besides, they didn't have the money. For now, he would have to content himself with just the city. Ma-Ani was one of the largest land ports on this world, which oddly enough was also Ma-Ani. The city had originally been located on an island along an inlet of the Great Eastern Ocean, but over the centuries had sprawled down along the shoreline. It was a popular tourist destination and had been for more than 200 cycles, 650 Earth years. The planet had gotten even more traffic recently, after the Ma-Anians were officially incorporated into the Pan-Galactic Senate. Apparently, Ma-Ani was only a Class 3 world, which Maverick found somewhat insulting. Things were plenty difficult here, even despite the low gravity and lack of large carnivores. The weather, for one thing, was unpredictable and variable. It frequently got down to 12 Celsius in winter, which could last more than 3 out of 22 months. What's more is that summer was accompanied by irregular rainfalls, dust storms, and an average temperature of 24 Celsius. Those were terrible conditions for most known crops. These tubers were the only things that grew somewhat reliably during winter. Maverick realized he was beginning to sound an awful lot like his brother-in-law. He sighed deeply. Maverick was jolted out of these musings by Hine, who had just grabbed his arm in a panic and was gesturing wildly towards the sky. At something. He saw it just in time, the explosion. His eye went wide. It had been a cruise ship. What was left of it began to fall, burning in the atmosphere around it. A small fragment broke off and followed a different trajectory. Maverick sat in shocked silence for a moment. When was the last time a disaster this big had happened? He didn't remember. Hine gripped his arm even tighter, her 7 slender fingers acting like a vice. Her face was pale, and her green eye just as wide as his. Then the shock wave reached them, rattling the wagon and spooking the Galpenny. Hine was down in a flash, calming the poor creature and caressing it. Maverick's attention was drawn back to the small fragment which seemed to be falling slightly slower than the rest of the debris. It also seemed it would land closer to them than to the city. "It's an escape pod," he exclaimed suddenly. "Eh?" The fragment crashed unceremoniously somewhere in the southeast. A black cloud of smoke billowed from the wreckage. "That?" asked Hine, pointing to the smoke. "We have to go. There could be survivors," he said. Wordlessly, Hine pulled herself back into the wagon. Maverick turned the wagon around and thanked the gods for giving him such a reliable partner. They turned onto a side road, going much faster than either were comfortable with. Maverick hoped their cargo wasn't being strewn across the ground behind them. After a good 20 minutes of their bone-rattling drive, the road veered away from the crash. Leaving Hine with the wagon, Maverick continued on foot over the rocky terrain that led into a shallow gorge. Near the bottom, he could see the wreckage. It was, indeed, the remains of an escape pod. He approached cautiously, picking over the loose rocks one at a time. He wondered if the creature inside was dangerous, and prayed it would not attack him. Maverick climbed to the bottom of the gorge. There was an unsettling sound emanating from the pod. It was a very high-pitched wail that continued on far longer than it should have. Steeling himself, Maverick took a breath and opened the pod's damaged door. Inside, there were two people, maybe creatures. One was a bit less than half his height. The other was so small he could probably have carried it in one hand. The smaller one was the one making the noise. The larger one lay face down without moving, as if the noise did not bother it at all. Its arm was curled around the smaller one. Maverick wondered if they were sentient. He'd never seen anything like them before. They had 2 fewer limbs than they should have, and very small heads with ears on the sides. Both had sickly-looking skin and fur only on the top of their heads. Maverick didn't think they were a threat. He crouched inside to get a better look. The larger one was very skinny, and even though he had no frame of reference for these things, he was quite certain it was malnourished. The smaller one temporarily stopped wailing to look at him. These weren't sentients after all. Both eyes were forward-facing. They must be some bizarre predator species a strange core world collector wanted for his menagerie. The smaller one scrunched up its face and went back to that unnatural wailing. Why would they be in a pod all by themselves? They must be somewhat intelligent. Forward-facing eyes didn't necessarily mean they were carnivores, Maverick reasoned. Plus, they were so small, even if they did want to attack, it wouldn't make a difference. Mustering up all his courage, he poked the larger one. No response. Maverick wondered if it was injured. The small one looked okay. He decided to turn it onto its back. Its skin was clammy, and something felt wet and slick. His hands were covered in a red fluid. Was that the color of its blood? He felt mildly ill. Its eyes were open, but unmoving. There was a deep gash in the creature's chest. He realized it was dead. The small one had stopped wailing and crawled to the bigger one's face and touched it. It whimpered something unintelligible, and the wailing began again. Maverick wondered if it meant it was grieving. He wondered if the large one had been its mother. Poor kid, he thought. He scooped the small one up. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and began the difficult walk back up the gorge.